Now, another bad day for Sydney, a record 177 new infections, so the numbers are still rising, but so far not exploding out of sight. Still, I can't see the lockdown ending for some weeks yet. One more death too, a woman in her 90s. Again, not vaccinated. I mean, why on earth not? You've got to protect yourself if you're an older Australian. If you're in your 90s, you are so likely to be hit hard by the virus if you get it. Get vaccinated. More on this topic later, but first, particularly politically, other bad news today for the New South Wales government with the return of a scandal from last year. The ABC is today reporting new claims involving Daryl Maguire, the former MP and former boyfriend of Premier Gladys Berejiklian. Now, we already learned at last year's anti-corruption hearings that Maguire, when he was an MP and the Premier's boyfriend, used his position to make money helping businessmen. That's quite wrong, but Berejiklian said she didn't know or condone any of that. And now the ABC is reporting that one of those businessmen that Maguire helped, Jimmy Liu, head of United World Enterprises, was allegedly, and I do emphasise allegedly, involved in major frauds on Australian taxpayers and investors, and in China. In one of those cases, Maguire staged a ceremony in the New South Wales Parliament House, in the Parliament itself, for this company, UWE, and a Chinese aged care company, which later found to have defrauded pensions in China of at least $46 million using Maguire's support of a UWE investment here. And its apparently impressive connections they helped too to con people out of their savings. Now, I should stress, of course, there is not the slightest evidence that Maguire actually knew he was being used by these conmen to sell their con, or that he knew that Liu's business here was doing anything wrong. Now, some of those involved in that aged care swindle have been jailed, but other victims who have lost all their money have staged protests and want Australian police to investigate the fraud and see if stolen money was sent to those Australian investments that Maguire was touting for his mate. Maguire and the Premier have refused to answer questions about this ABC report. I was joined earlier by Sky News Political Editor Andrew Clennell, and I asked him how much of this was new and serious.
I think what was aired at ICAC was more serious accusations about the Premier's knowledge of a former boyfriend's lobbying as an MP, which was against the rules and is subject now of a corruption investigation. And the fact that she never went and spoke to authorities about that as required under the ICAC Act, and that's a consideration for her. So if she hasn't had to resign over that, I doubt she'll be resigning over this story, put it that way. But there is a lot of talk around the place that ICAC are looking at other matters involving Daryl Maguire and the Premier. And I guess we're in the middle of a lockdown, so we won't hear anything more about that for some time. But it does seem to have a sort of Damocles feel over the head of Gladys Berejiklian, and now we know she's dating her ICAC barrister, Arthur Moses, so he won't be representing her anymore. So yeah, I mean it's a colourful story. Put it that way.
You've got there. Small place.
Only in Sydney. Only in Sydney, Andrew.
Let's go to the virus catastrophe. The Prime Minister's under huge pressure, of course, to over this vaccine rollout being so slow, and he faces an election in within a year, so he really wants to get this right behind him before he faces the voters. He wants to be able to say, look, I've fixed it, or who remembers back when it was all so slow. He today, I thought, went out on a bit of a limb and claimed that every Australian will have the opportunity to be vaccinated by Christmas, so that may well happen, but lockdowns will be a thing of the past, which seems to me a big call. And he said life will be very different by the end of the year. He'd better be right, hadn't he?
Well, he said before that Singapore's locked down and other places are locked down when they've got high rates of vaccination. So I guess it depends which press conference you turn up to, Andrew, what message you get with the PM sometimes. But look, I think, to be honest, I think he's just trying to get some hope into the people of Sydney, and I can hardly bag him for that, the way people are feeling at the moment. That what's been said to me by various experts in the federal government is that there'll be less incidents of lockdowns, but there won't be no lockdowns. Look, I just agree with you that Scott Morrison's in an awful lot of trouble. I mean, we had a report in the Fin Review today, adding researcher, a Labor polling firm, admittedly, that found, despite all their mistakes, Gladys Berejiklian is still tracking okay, but Scott Morrison's rating has significantly dropped. So it sounds like there's more in Sydney blaming Scott Morrison for the slow vaccine rollout than Gladys Berejiklian for being slow in going to lockdown. So that's quite interesting, and it might explain why the Premier keeps mentioning vaccination and the slow speed of it to get some of the heat off herself. And Scott Morrison's almost relegated to irrelevance. He's got real problems going forward in Sydney. It's an area the Liberal Party wanted to pick up 4 seats, at least on the fringes, Central Coast, Blue Mountains. Things go the way they're going at the moment, they can kiss all of those potential gains goodbye. And Anthony Albanese, I think, would have a spring in his step. Long way to go, of course. Morrison's got a miracle victory under his belt before, but boy, he said it's not a race. He's in a bit of strife.
You know what they say about lightning striking twice? And I have to say, too, it's a bit of a numbers game, isn't it? I mean, Scott Morrison's got every single Premier and Chief Minister wanting to accuse him. It's only him against all them. He's always going to lose out in those maths. Sydney's lockdown's now going to go on for 4 weeks. So I hear a lot of people saying it's time for a much tougher lockdown, more expanded lockdown. I've heard people suggest the curfew, all that kind of thing. I'm just wondering, though, how much of the problems with this particular form of lockdown come to the fact, not about how broad it is, but the fact that what rules there are not being properly followed or enforced. I mean, you've got photographs of lots of workers sitting around, without masks. You've got people not staying at home when they're supposed to be isolated. And, well, tell us about this Sudanese funeral that turns out to be a super spreader.
Well, it's a shocking and sad story, and it should give people some pause if they're thinking of breaking the rules. 50 people go to this funeral of a loved aunt of the Sudanese community in Pendle Hill near Blacktown out western Sydney, and 45 of them end up with the virus, and one of them passes away. So you go to a funeral, spread the virus, and someone passes away, you've got another funeral on your hands. Can you believe it? So sad. Where's the New South Wales government been on this? 5 weeks into lockdown, kids out of school, people out of work. Shouldn't they have been on this harder from day one? Now, they're going to make some announcement about extra police on it. I think the Army should be looking at making sure contacts are isolating. If you go through WA's hard border and you isolate for 14 days, the cops come around your house every day to make sure you're home. I just think they have to throw everything at it. There's too much being lost here in terms of schooling, in terms of employment, in terms of mental health. If you are going to go lockdown, and I know you've had your reservations about that strategy big time, but if you are going to do it properly or don't do it at all. And that's been my point from day one.
Look, I've been in two minds about the lockdown in Sydney. The lockdowns elsewhere, yes, I do have big doubts about that. But I agree with you. Once you do it, you have to enforce the rules. So what's the point? You're only punishing, the law-abiding, and the non-law-abiding get away with it, and you don't really achieve much. I think it's just incredible. The one thing I would say, though, Andrew, the government was already under a lot of pressure about being racist and discriminatory by sending extra police to those areas of Sydney that were worst hit, that actually happened to be most ethnically diverse. People saying you're anti-Muslim, you're anti-this, you're anti-that. I don't know if sending the army to those areas would actually make things better in that regard.
Yeah, I've heard all that, and I know that's been a discussion in the crisis cabinet meetings, but at the end of the day, I mean, you're not really... What else can you do? Let's just have a 6-month lockdown instead. We can't be fearful of enforcing the rules, as you say, otherwise the rules get broken by a few and everyone suffers.